One of your roles is to advise people about how to select juries, or which jurors might be beneficial to have on the jury and which ones might not be so beneficial. So what are some of the things you do to help you select which juror should be on the trial?
We take a number of approaches. One approach that we can take is that we would conduct a survey in the trial jurisdiction, and through that survey we would find out what kind of jurors tend to have certain opinions that might be relevant to the case. And in fact, we may present them with a hypothetical or an actual description of our case and get to respond to several issues in the case, and as a result of that, start to see who tends to side more with one side versus the other. And what we do is statistically develop profiles of favorable and unfavorable jurors.
So the goal is to use information you get from the population in the local area to make inferences about how particular jurors might respond.
Exactly. We cannot use the actual jurors, obviously, and so what we do is that we sample and do public opinion polling in that trial jurisdiction.
And from what I understand, in some very rare cases, you can actually ask jurors directly about particular issues, but that's not the norm. It's really you have to.
It really depends on the case. There's two ways that we can ask questions of actual jurors. One is through a juror questionnaire, which is used very rarely, but is a questionnaire that has both demographic and experience and attitudinal measures on it, and we can have them fill that out before they're going through the voir dire process, the questioning process. And then when we're in the voir dire process, that's when attorneys can actually question, in many jurisdictions, questions to jurors and find out how they feel, how they think, and what views that might impact the case.
So do you think sort of with the amount of information that's available online now, with people filling out information on Facebook and Twitter about themselves, does that now come into play in terms of how you might select specific jurors?
That plays a big role nowadays. There's a lot of information that we collect from the internet, and basically what we're looking at is the juror's internet footprint. So we not only have the information that you might get from a Google search, we also have information from people's Facebook pages, Twitter, on Instagram, a variety of sources on the internet that can give us a pretty interesting look at who these people are.
So are there any sort of global things that you look for in a juror, for example, if you're working for the defense?
It really depends on the case. If it's a criminal case, we're oftentimes looking to identify people who might lean towards the prosecution or might accept the government's case a little more easily than they would accept the defendant's case. And this might be connections with law enforcement. It might be experience that they've had with law enforcement that left them with a very good impression. And also simply asking them whether or not they would take the word of a law enforcement officer more so than they would of other people, simply because they're a law enforcement officer.
So there's a measure called the juror bias scale, which I'm sure you're familiar with, that
Yes.
asks a lot of those sorts of questions.
Right.
Is that sort of the way you might get it, if you could ask specific jurors?
If we could ask specific jurors, we would ask them those kind of questions. We'd also ask them questions that relate to the circumstances of the case. Have they had experiences maybe with sexual assault? Have they had a friend or family member, and in the United States this can happen, who's been killed or seriously injured as a result of some criminal wrongdoing? And so we will pursue those kind of areas to see whether or not they might be more receptive to the other side and less receptive to our side.
So it really comes down to kind of a mix of some things which might be fairly consistent across different types of cases, but then also some very context-specific information you're trying to either get direct information about or infer from other sources.
That's exactly the point, is that we start off with the more global measures, much like the juror bias scale, and start to look at, from that, go on to look at what specific aspects of our case are unique and might trigger a response from jurors that we want to take into account.
So maybe a difficult question now. How do you know you've given the right advice? Like, how do you know that you've selected the right jurors onto the case, without the verdict aside?
Well, we don't know until the verdict is in. But what we do in advance is that we will oftentimes pretest a case. We'll oftentimes look at, are our profiles telling us what we think they're telling us? And that is that we can take, for example, the juror bias scale. if we're going to be using a measure like that, what we can do is that we can conduct mock trials beforehand. We can include these kind of measures in that and see whether or not, in fact, people who score high or low actually tend to or are differentiated in their verdicts. And so we actually test things out. And so that's the ideal approach that we would take.
So what you sort of described sounds like what a lot of researchers do as part of their day-to-day jobs. Like they'll actually conduct a mock trial or a simulated trial, and use measures like the juror bias scale and try and look at what the effect of certain variables is. But I guess your purpose is a little bit different. Most researchers are trying to generalize to all trials, but what you're really interested in is this specific fact circumstance.
We're interested in the specific case, and in fact, the research methodologies come from the same place that you have your research methodologies. We all come from the same tree, if you will. We're just a different branch.
Trial preparation, I imagine, would have more general purposes as well. So what's some of the thinking behind, or what's some of the strategy behind how you prepare a case to trial?
Well, we do a number of things. One is that if we have an opportunity, we'd like to pre-test a case because as it currently stands, your final verdict is going to be the result. And we want to see, if we pre-test it, we want to see what that result might be and what might we be able to do in order to change things. And so we will talk to jurors afterwards, or these are our mock jurors, if you will. We'll talk to them afterwards and find out what would have to change in order for them to change their opinion, and do they think the information that we presented that we thought was important, is that really what they think is important? And oftentimes it's not. And we go by what the jurors tell us are important, and then we will adjust our case going to trial. We also provide assistance in the persuasive aspects of the case. That is, a client will come to me, and this is the case they have, and we will talk to them about the themes of the case. Because oftentimes attorneys haven't really thought about the theme of the case. We need to have, as many of the viewers be aware, we need to have ways of integrating the information, because there's a lot of information that people get at trial. And we need to have them sort through it, and sort through it in a manner that is favorable to our client. But we will apply psychological principles. We'll talk about themes. We'll talk about the structure of persuasion and how they can be better. And that's what we work with.
If you had a single bit of advice that you would give to somebody who's, perhaps preparing for a trial, what's the simple thing they can do to help make their case more persuasive?
Well, remember who your decision makers are. They're not judges. They're actual people from your community. And how would you tell your story, and how would you convince them that your side should win, knowing that they are your average people from the community? Because once you forget that, that's when you lose them. And we have to remember that the jurors are not familiar with your case like you are. And so the attorneys have to really step back and go, wait a minute here. I've got to tell them a story. I've got to give them information in chunks that they can understand if I expect them to decide my way. And that's really what we have to stress.
Changing tracks slightly, what do you think of how your business, or your sort of profession is? How's that portrayed in popular media, like on films or in books? How realistic is that in terms of what you actually do on a day-to-day basis?
It's not as realistic as we would hope, and so that's Hollywood. They have to sell movies, but that's not what we do.